The work that this initiative is doing and Historic Columbia is doing is something that we all need to be proud of and applaud. And Robin, when she knew about this film, she said, let's do this at the Carriage House. And then I turned to the staff at the JCC and I said, who can we get to come and talk about this? Barry and Lori both said, well, we need to get Dr. Sam Richardson to come and talk because he was in our community. And how many people were interviewed by Dr. Richardson when he came? All right, raise your hands high so you can see. I know Lily was, she told me, Bobby. But what he's going to talk about today, he's going to talk about Columbia, a leading small Jewish community at a crossroads. And let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Richardson. Dr. Richardson grew up in Grand Junction, Colorado, and he's lived most of his adult life in small towns and cities. When he was 36, he realized that he could not answer the question, will I have Jewish grandchildren? And he set out on an academic journey to discover how Jewish parents could increase their chances of having grandchildren with strong Jewish identities. In pursuit of a PhD in sociology, specializing in religion and family, Sam's research has taken him to several small Jewish communities around the United States, including Columbia. His online survey drew responses from over 40 such communities nationwide. Sam was awarded a PhD from the University of Virginia this past May, and he is now sharing the results of his research with Jewish parents and Jewish communities. He's married to Amy. He's the father of Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. All right, Dr. Sam wrote this. It wasn't me. And he's Saba to Maggie and Ren, the two most bright and beautiful little girls on the planet.
Thank you very much for having me here today. And just to round out those matriarchs, my youngest daughter, Rachel, her middle name is Leah. So we covered all bases. Thank you. You all should have two blue pieces of paper, one stapled, one not, in front of you. Those are directly related to the talk I'm giving. Up here on this tall table, there are some white papers with some brief columns that I did for Jewish Values Online that speak to more directly to the issues at hand. So as I'm trying to maintain a focused position today on the history and contemporary position of Columbia as a Jewish community, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to share with you some data, both from my interviews as well as from the online survey, and then I'm definitely going to open it up for questions or challenges, because I'm sure that with as many people gathered in this room, there are at least twice as many different opinions. Because yes, we know it's true. So as you know, for 200 years, more than 200 years, the Jewish community of Columbia has been a visible and viable presence. And in many ways, Columbia reflects the common story of Jewish immigration from Europe, the settlement, difficulties with different traditions and personalities within the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community. And how we have navigated that space is actually quite common from small community to small community. And so I'd like to share with you a bit about that common narrative. And it's actually part of a shared memory that has shaped not only the development of American Jewry, but worldwide Jewry, as it begins in the early chapters of the Bible with our patriarchs and our matriarchs, the themes of exile, wandering alienation, settlement, and partial redemption. And this narrative is often considered at the macro level when dealing with Am Yisrael, but it's also a very important narrative to be considered when we're talking about small Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, specifically in America. Author and educator Francis Nataf suggests that we consider Jacob and Moses. Both were men forced to leave their family, the land of their upbringing, because of a threat on their life. And each of them spent time wandering in the wilderness of a culture different from their own, eventually choosing to settle themselves in communities with different values and different theologies. During their journeys, both Jacob and Moses faced challenges to their concepts of reality, to their individual and corporate identities, and finally they took up positions as leaders of their own people with a vision to settle in this new land and also return to some of the old ways. And in ways not so different from their ancient forebears, many Jewish men left Europe, arriving in the United States, having lost family members to pogroms, community-wide and state-sanctioned anti-Semitic oppression, very personal attacks by business and political office holders and community leaders. And as they journeyed away from their land and their own people and the culture that they had known and came to these shores, they created small Jewish communities like none had ever been formed in history. The classic area of small Jewish life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these small Jewish communities, would not have resembled the larger Jewish centers of Boston, New York, Baltimore, any more than we are like them today. There were differences then, and there are differences today. And these young, small Jewish communities did not have the Jewish social political structure as the larger eastern cities, as, again, we don't have that today. Rather, what attracted the European Jewish immigrants to small communities was at least as much familial and personal connection as business opportunities. In many cases, like their forefathers Jacob and Moses, who took up residence among peoples with different values, these peddlers and other merchants had to acclimate to the American landscape, political system, and diverse religious beliefs. Perhaps the key to their success was the widely accepted civil religion of ethical monotheism as espoused by the American founders. Thus, the challenges were much different on these shores than they had been in Europe. Rather than seeking to remain apart from the larger culture, these men and women were challenged to conduct business and form a social life with accented English or no English at all. They didn't understand how Americans conducted business. Sometimes they had to decide whether it was safe to accept financial assistance from basic facilitation of commercial transactions or even capital finance, living quarters, and other types of logistical opportunities from Christians where they would have never done that in the country of their birth. So rather than being excluded from political and economic life, they were actually enjoined to it by people that they had not expected such friendship and opportunity. So like Moses, who found himself to be a stranger in a strange land, during his 40 years of dwelling in Midian, Jewish immigrants to these small communities often found themselves emphasizing their Jewish identity because of the strangeness of the customs that they found here. And in the end, this was a net gain for Jewish communities, who even today demonstrate higher than average Jewish identity than those who live in our urban Jewish centers. You'll hear a theme throughout that it's difficult to be Jewish in small communities, but that's a good thing. With the genesis of every Jewish small community in America, it had something to do with social and financial connections. However, we don't find a lot of legal documents illustrating the establishment of a Jewish community through purchases and through legal contracts. But we find that it was because of the basic human conditions of frailty and mortality, that Jewish communities established and put down roots in these small communities. For example, the Columbia Hebrew Burial Society was founded in 1822, established a cemetery in 1826, and the importance of this permanent institution was illustrated by the fact that while the original synagogue was destroyed during the days of the Civil War and not rebuilt until 1900, the cemetery was cared for in every way. And that's a story that we see throughout small Jewish communities up and down the eastern seaboard. These emerging Jewish communities were not immune to the difficult times, the anti-Semitic attitudes, and occasionally the violence endured by all American Jewish communities. And of course, some in the American South, caught in the midst of the Civil War, found themselves in the late 19th century reconstructing their communities alongside their other southern neighbors. The Jewish merchants of Columbia, as I'm sure most of you know, made the choice that, while avant-garde for the day, would later be considered a model for American ethnic relations. They chose to build their new stores on Association Street, side by side with the merchants from the black community, and the only neighborhood in the southern town where non-whites could shop freely. That is a mark of pride that all of Jewish Columbia needs to maintain. I'm going to jump ahead a few decades to contemporary times. And not that a lot of important things didn't happen in the early and mid-20th century, but the Jewish community in the early mid-20th century was fairly stable and growing until we come to the 1970s. In the 1970s, there was an economic crisis, both globally as well as nationally, with the reduction in manufacturing. Jewish communities such as Ashland, Kentucky and Asheville, North Carolina suffered severe losses. Columbia held its own because there was an economic reorientation from wholesale and retail trades to the medical, legal, and academic vocation. And that's pretty much what we see here today. While there's still some of the mercantile activities going on, it's primarily a professional community. Other places that were not able to make that transition found themselves closing their doors in the late 1970s and 1980s. And when this happened, it finally occurred to demographers, beginning with the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, that they needed to take notice of Jews living in small communities. So in the 2000-2001 National Jewish Population Survey, there was actually a presentation created by that research team and presented to the Federation's Small Cities Institute titled Jews in Small Communities. And while it was the first of its kind, it wasn't something that really took hold of the imagination of the Jewish academic community. There are some important books, and on the blue sheet I have given you a few of the texts that I believe are important to understanding small Jewish community life. But then when the recession of 2008 came, we saw a significant decrease in the number of Jewish communities that were able to maintain their buildings, their community centers, and at one point in 2009-2010, there was one Jewish community every month that was turning out the lights because they couldn't afford to keep going. And there was some movement between communities and certainly families that were either coming together or breaking apart, but it was a time of tragedy that was unprecedented in American Jewish history. So finally in 2013, the Pew Report came out, a portrait of Jewish Americans, and they knew that they needed to focus on small people who live in small communities, but they got it a little wrong. Rather than focusing on small Jewish communities, they focused on Jews in small communities, which of course is something totally different. And in my opinion, they also were asking the wrong questions. And so the data from the 2000-2001 National Jewish Population Survey is somewhat helpful. However, it was only a beginning. The data from the Pew Survey is actually not helpful at all to understanding who we are as small Jewish communities. But then, last year, the movie that we're going to be seeing, There Are Jews Here, is the untold story of 4 once thriving American Jewish communities that are now barely holding on. And I greatly appreciate this film, and I think you will too. The producers, Lichtenstein and Johnson, demonstrate their core interest of the project by observing the root issue facing small Jewish communities. And this is also the focus of my research. For them, Jewish identity is a daily urgent challenge. If they don't personally uphold their communities and live affirmative Jewish lives, they and their legacies could fade away forever. So, I got a bug. I traveled to Jewish communities across the country, 4 different states, 4 different regions, to learn how these communities have managed to move through each moment of time and remain viable across the generations. And the stories that I heard here in Columbia, Charleston, West Virginia, Boise, Idaho, have been overwhelming in the enthusiasm and pride that people have for their communities. Stories of what had been built by great-grandparents, grandparents, distant aunts and uncles, people with names and pictures and stories that the community owned and are part of who they are today. As I interviewed people who had grown up and lived in these communities for decades and listened to focus group discussions comprised of those who had their finger on the pulse of the community, several key domains of continuity emerged and caused me to do some refocusing and some deeper dives. The first one is that values regarding the community, what makes us special, is something that has both common themes as well as distinctives in each community. Family, the core identity of most small Jewish communities. And that family is not the nuclear family, but it is the larger community as family and the connections we have therein. The rabbi. Some communities may not have a rabbi, or if they do, it's one person who sometimes feels like they're literally holding everything together with Scotch tape and glue. But they are a significant portion of that community and inspire people to continuing. That we know we're different. We purposely mark ourselves off from the larger community. Because if we don't, we have this sense that we will disappear. So we mark ourselves off. We know we have issues to face and problems to solve. We do compare ourselves to the larger communities. And sometimes we say, why can't we? Or why should we? And I don't know that that's the best thing to do. Finally, a question that I have been asking, which is not a fun question, but I think it needs to be asked, is what would this community lose if we were to disappear? Because there's something, I think, rich and vibrant and necessary that American Jewry has brought to small town life in America that would be a tragic loss if we were to allow ourselves to disappear. So I made a big assumption that our values, both conscious and unconscious, ultimately drive our actions. And in each community, as well as the online survey, I asked people to rank the 12 values that you'll find on the other handout. And where I spoke to people face to face, doing my site research, 3 values were consistently ranked highest. 1, chesed, loving kindness. 2, ahavat ger, loving the stranger. And 3, kavod, respect, dignity, and honor. And I think each of these makes complete sense given the common history of small Jewish communities who, when they were founded, were received by family and even strangers with loving kindness. So both of those, the chesed and the ahavat ger, go together. And then finally the kavod, having respect and dignity for oneself and one's community, which gives you then the desire and the strength to carry on in the face of adversity. However, when I looked at Colombia, there was an interesting difference. For Colombia, number 1, chesed, loving kindness, that equates. But 2 was tzedakah. 3 was kavod. And number 6 was ahavat ger. So there was a change. Colombia replaced ahavat ger, number 2, with tzedakah. And so we have to ask, why is Colombia so different from the other communities? And what I think the answer to that is that due to the unique business decisions that Colombia made post-Civil War, there's been a conscious understanding of loving the stranger that is lived out every day, very naturally, very unconsciously, and so it's a moment-by-moment thing that people just are not aware of. However, regarding tzedakah, which is righteousness, but we think of it in our contemporary time of righteousness expressed through donation of time and effort and resources. In Colombia, there's 3 synagogues, 3 Jewish schools, 2 youth groups, a Hillel, JCC, Federation, JFS, multiple historic and cultural groups. Plenty of opportunity to donate time and talent and resources. So that is a conscious thing in the life of Jewish Colombia. However, the number of Jewish institutions and the opportunity for tzedakah, I believe, betrays one of Jewish Colombia's greatest challenges. Jewish Colombia thinks big. But a Jewish Colombia thinks big. But Colombia is small. And there's a real concern among some in this community who I've spoken with that the variety and magnitude of the programming is not sustainable in the long term. And I would add that programming, which is found in abundance in the large urban centers, they're hemorrhaging Jews. They have the funding, they have the professionals, they have the programming, they have everything you need. But they're hemorrhaging Jews. Therefore, I think we have to ask, is programming the answer? And, of course, I wouldn't be asking the question if I wouldn't say no. Programming is not the answer. How do we develop Jewish children into Jewish adults with a strong and viable Jewish identity? I want to encourage you to think small rather than thinking big. And by this I don't mean small thinking, but moving from the focus on the large to the focus on the small, from the institution to the home, from the program to the relationship. Thinking small requires us to ask how today's parents will increase their chances of having Jewish grandchildren at the Seder table in 2027 or 2037. And as I know you all know, that day is going to come quicker than you think. The past 50 years of Jewish history, even more than that, go to the middle of the 20th century. It's been about growth that has to do with bricks and bucks and professionals. And often at the expense of those for whom our institutional resources are intended to serve. From elementary education to birthright trips, interfaith dialogue to domestic and international policy issues, we have all been trained as a society to think globally, without consideration for how the individual units, communities, families, individuals might bend, break, or run away under the weight of the superstructure. Now is the time to think small. How might changes in economics, technology, and policy be leveraged here in Columbia to enhance the lives of the 14-year-olds, the single moms, the interfaith couples in our midst? How can overscheduled families be encouraged to make different priorities with intentional Judaism much higher up on the list, rather than a convenient fourth, fifth, or sixth? I think such bite-sized visions of the future are more manageable in real time than our grand visions on the large scale. Finally, a strategy of thinking small just might have a better chance of turning out more Jewish people in 2067 than in 2017 has been with large thinking. There are some bright spots to be found in Columbia, and I want to highlight those. Some of these quotes are on your handout. One man I interviewed said, "I would say the key values here are marriage and family, also education and a work ethic. These may have had an impact on the number of graduates from the class of 2000 who have returned to Columbia. I would say anywhere between 33 and 40%, which is huge." Then he said the number is somewhat lower now, maybe 25%, but here's the key. Mostly girls are coming back with Jewish husbands. And this has been something consistent I have found, that late millennial and even mid-millennial women are totally open to intermarriage, but they're not open to interfaith household. And so they're specifically looking for those men with a very low religious identity of whatever their background is, to then be supportive of having a Jewish home and raising their kids Jewishly, and hopefully converting themselves as well. My middle daughter, that's exactly who she found, which, of course, Papa's ideal wasn't met, but better to have someone who's willing to be totally supportive of a Jewish home than to have a division in the family. So somebody else put it a different way. We welcome the stranger, get them involved, wanting to participate. Blending and assimilating to the larger community is not wanted because there's so few new Jewish families and individuals. And Columbia does this very well. My own experience, from other people I've spoken to who haven't been here very long, you bring people in, you love them up, bring them into Jewish space, and you make sure they understand all the opportunities that are available to them. And this is why you don't want to be Atlanta or Tampa or Baltimore. Because individuals and Jewish families in Columbia as a small Jewish community work well as a small Jewish community. Words of another woman who actually moved to Atlanta for a time and then came back. She said, "It's too easy to be Jewish in the big cities. You can do what you want to do and not what you don't want to do." Here we're more connected to the Jewish community because in Atlanta it wasn't special. When I went to synagogue in Atlanta for the first time, I don't think anyone realized I was there because there were like 200 people in the synagogue. Any other time I have been to a smaller town, when I go to the synagogue, the people swarm you, you have dinner invites for 2 weeks, and there's something special about being Jewish in a small place. When you think big, when you try to be big, you lose the strength of thinking and being small. When you consciously realize that you are small, and complement that with thinking small, there is holy magic that appears. One Colombian mom put it this way: My relatives in New Jersey and Philadelphia, they take their Judaism for granted, and we don't. Our kids are special when they go to school. There's something different about them. We have to work a little harder. We don't miss things. We make sure we're at all of the cultural celebrations. We take advantage of all the opportunities here, and we don't take it for granted. That's thinking small. My internet survey, as I mentioned earlier, I was privileged to have over 600 responses from over 40 different small Jewish communities. And there were 14 responses from Columbia. Thank you very much for those who participated. They also demonstrated what it is to think small instead of thinking big. I asked what their communities need in order to pass along Jewish values to their children. I gave them 5 choices. Do you need more help from the rabbi? More help from a children's education program? More holistic family education? More adult education to help parents better educate their children? Or parents who are more focused on teaching their children with Jewish values? The number one answer across the board was parents being more focused on teaching their children. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, former head rabbi of the UK, he said we need to stop the outsourcing. Parents outsource their children's education. But if we insource it, then we are going to be successful not only as Jewish educators, but as Jewish families. I totally buy into that. Yeah, 5 minutes. Columbia responded a little differently. Columbia said first, children's education program, then the rabbi, then holistic family education. This is not an example of thinking small. I was a bit surprised, but it could be that the institutional presence in Columbia is a bit overwhelming. Parents are uncertain of their own ability to teach their children, and I would encourage you to correct that situation as soon as possible. When asked about the most important ways for children to receive a Jewish education, survey responses indicated, number 1, grandparents and extended family, 2, parents, 3, Jewish community, 4, professional Jewish educator. Responses from Columbia actually were much more in line with what I like to see. Parents and extended family were a virtual tie. That was awesome. When I asked what a child needs to grow up with a strong Jewish identity, my survey respondents said a strong Jewish home, nursery school, Jewish education, extended family. From Columbia, overwhelmingly a strong Jewish home. That's good. That's what I want to see. And that's thinking small. I want to close by telling you how happy I was to hear from a few of the teens in Jewish Columbia. And I asked them how they know if somebody their age has a strong Jewish identity. And one guy immediately said, because they tell you. But then his friend said, no. You have to see that they're doing something Jewish. They have to be willing to show you that they're Jewish. That's thinking small. It's thinking big to merely say, oh yeah, I'm Jewish. That's easy. Thinking small is taking the harder step and doing. It's hard to be Jewish, but thinking small provides the magic and the utility that we need to raise the next Jewish generation. Thank you.
Margot.
I have
Yes.
a question because
Sure.
number one, what was your criteria for a small community? Because for me, Columbia was a big community.
I understand, yes. My criteria is that in the general geographic area there are between 1,000 and 3,000 Jewish individuals. Well, it's big enough. Right. Below 1,000 is a micro community, and below 250 is a sub-micro community. The reason I made that distinction is because just over the past 200 years, it's been fairly predictable that communities with less than 1,000 Jewish individuals, when they encounter a significant economic crisis, will die out. So that's my... Thank you for that question.
Rob, was it you?
Same question.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
You noted that Jewish girls wanted to raise their children Jewish, and even if they
Right.
looked for a mate, they wanted to find someone who was willing to
Exactly.
do it. How about Jewish males?
Jewish men, like other American men, are not willing to commit as early or as significantly as they were 50 years ago. There is a national suppression of young men in making those types of commitments. When as a general rule across the nation, this varies somewhat by region, but not a whole lot, that your average 22-year-old male is not thinking anything about families. But your average 22-year-old female is thinking career and family. And the pool of men for mid-20-somethings is very, very low. And those women who do get married actually have the highest opportunity for successful long-term marriages. Whereas if they wait to the average age of 29 or 30, then their chance, number one, for finding a mate is lower, and for successful marriage is even lower than
But
that.
how about when those Jewish men do marry, those young Jewish men do marry? Do they assimilate, or is that when we're losing a large portion of the Jewish population?
No, if a Jewish man marries a Jewish woman and they both have a strong identity, they're probably going to do pretty well as their children. If they both have a weak Jewish identity, they're probably going to assimilate.
And what if they don't marry Jewish?
And if they don't, then unless the Jewish man has a very strong Jewish identity, he is going to subsume to his non-Jewish partner. So these are things that, as parents, we need to understand as we're raising our children, so that they can make better decisions. Yes, sir.
So reviewing intermarriage over a historical period, whether it be during the time of the Greeks, the Romans, most recently Europe within the last 150 years, assimilation has never really seemed to, this is just personal opinion here, work. But the intermarriage has been rapidly increased the last 150 years. And
Yes.
I was just wondering, America's rather unique compared to Europe, historically speaking. Let me ask you a question. What do you think the outcome is going to be? Because as we just addressed here, the women are marrying non-Jews.
Right.
The men are not marrying, or if they are marrying, okay, this is a dilemma. This is a major dilemma that is first we see in, the last, 2,000 years or so?
You're exactly right. My answer to this dilemma is focusing on small Jewish communities. Because what demographically is going to happen in the urban centers is that most Jews are going to assimilate and become secular, and the rest are going to be Orthodox. So New York, Los Angeles, Baltimore, Denver, Chicago is going to be Orthodox. Even just without any change in the Jewish middle demographics, by 2065, 40% of all American Jews will be Orthodox. However, if we look at small Jewish communities where the heart of the Jewish middle, I think, resides, and we can maintain those Jewish middle values, we can, in 2065 and 2100, have a thriving American Jewish community that is, and I'm not saying Orthodox is not healthy, but is other than secular, representing traditional Jewish values within an open societal context, if that makes sense.
It does, but what is going to spin that around? Because right now, it's the intermarriage rate it's increasing. It's increasing. So what I'm asking, simple question is, what is going to stop and bring that back on the decline?
By raising children with strong Jewish values, so that even the women who do marry out bring their husbands in and establish those Jewish homes to raise children with strong Jewish values.
And that's going to offset the man marrying the non-Jews.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
We have
absolutely.
one more question.
I'm just curious, what is the Jewish population in Colombia, and how is this determined? Do you look at people that belong to Jewish institutions? Because I know right off the top of my head, a bunch of people that were born into Jewish homes and really are unaffiliated with anything now. Are they still counted as Jews, and how do you do that count?
Excellent question, which I don't have time to give you a full answer on. I use the data from the Federation's independent communities data set, and in order to do my initial counts, and then I did some aggregate collection from institutions. But you are correct, those numbers really aren't good. And so my estimate for Colombia is somewhere around 2,800. but I don't know. One thing that I need to do is we need to actually have a survey of small Jewish communities so that we actually know. And the short answer to the who is a Jew question is that I created my own definition for my purposes, and that is if you have to answer yes to these two questions. One, do you consider yourself Jewish? Two, do other people in your community also consider you to be Jewish? If you answer yes to both of those, I'm willing to count you in my survey.
Good, okay.
You're welcome.
Let's give Dr. Richardson a round.